giving them extra tools to help them to do that. Police have been doing some excellent work so far, both in working with communities and in reducing the number of guns on our streets. Through Operation Tauwhero, over 1,800 firearms have been seized, nearly 1,500 arrests have been made, and 10,000 grams of methamphetamine have been removed from circulation. But as a government, we are keen to make sure that we can do more, and that involves making sure the police have the right tools to be able to do that. We've already put funding into the Gang Intelligence Centre, which enables greater collaboration across different government agencies, non-government organisations and the community. We've increased the number of frontline staff working in specific roles that are tackling organised crimes. We're progressing the firearms protection orders through Parliament. We've banned semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles. We've removed 60,000 guns from circulation through the gun buyback scheme. And we are in the process of putting in place the firearms register and improving the gun licensing system. The government's also funded the rollout of the frontline response model across the country to improve the safety of frontline police and communities. But we want to make sure that there are some real practical measures that police can take when tackling the gangs. So here's the things that we are now going to be putting in place. We'll be introducing a new offence in the Crimes Act that could carry a penalty of up to 5 years in prison if a firearm is discharged with the intent to intimidate any person or group of people. We'll be making an amendment to the Search and Surveillance Act to provide police with additional search powers that will help them to target gang members during gang conflict. We'll be introducing a new cash seizure power to allow police to seize cash thought to be over $10,000 when that is found in suspicious circumstances. We'll be adding watches, jewellery, precious metals and stones, motor vehicles and ships to the list of high-value goods that are prohibited for sale using cash over certain amounts, and that'll involve amending the Anti-Money Laundering and Countering Financing of Terrorism Act. And we're expanding the range of offences that could result in the impoundment of cars, motorbikes and other vehicles. This will include dangerous and reckless driving that we've seen during recent gang convoys. We've been working alongside the police, listening to what they know will help them to do a better job, and we've made these changes, or we will be making these changes as a result of those discussions. Basically, we want to hit the gangs and the offenders where it's going to hurt them. It's by going after their guns, their cars, their motorbikes, and making it harder for them to launder money. We're also responding to increased incidents of intimidation and violence on our roads and streets and in homes. This will work alongside the intervention work ministers are doing to stop people, particularly young people, from getting into gangs and this kind of criminal offending in the first place. I'll now hand over to Minister Allan and then we'll be happy to take some questions.
Morena koto. It's Dr. Jared Gilbert that said that solutions need to target particular problems, and this has been the approach that we have taken since we have pulled together the suite of reforms. One of the current problems New Zealanders are worried about, and rightly so, it's the spike in gang warfare, as evidenced just here. So we've designed a fit-for-purpose responses that are targeted at quelling the gang warfare by, as my colleague said, hitting them where it hurts. We're going after guns, vehicles and cash. New Zealanders have the absolute right to feel safe in our homes, and the police need the adequate powers to do their job. The Ministry of Justice have worked closely with the police to design the suite of targeted measures to ensure police have the tools that they need to tackle violent organised criminal behaviour, whilst also ensuring that the measures are evidence-based and uphold the rule of law. The reality is, as we all know, people don't become gang members overnight. There are enough evidence-based reports to show that the contributing factors for joining gangs hinge on socio-economic factors, families, community environments or lack thereof, and a desire for a sense of belonging. Often these are intergenerational issues and they're complex. Well, today's announcements are about ensuring that the police have the right tools to crack down on gang behaviour that is violent and completely unacceptable. We also are acutely aware that the best tool that we have is prevention. Preventing people joining gangs in the first instance, we know, will always be better than a belated cure. We know that early intervention, rehabilitation and reintegration is the most effective route to sustained and long-term harm reduction. We know that programs targeted towards preventing kids and young people from entering the justice system leads to a reduction in gang membership and turning to a life of crime. We're working across the sector to tackle the causes of gang participation, and I'll be looking particularly closely at the youth justice system to see how we can make changes to improve both the lives of at-risk people and public safety in the long term. In addition, my colleagues, the Minister of Police and the Minister of Social Development, are leading work on the drivers of youth offending, with the Associate Minister of Education focusing on improving educational outcomes for risk that are at-risk youth. So this work is in addition to a broad and concerted effort across government targeting law and order measures. Through Budget 22, the government announced a $562 million law and order package, and that included a $94.5 million package, which is all of government cross-agency response to tackling gangs and organised crime. The measures that we're introducing today are intended to be pragmatic. They're intended to be a targeted suite of tools that will enable the police to be able to do their job and, like I said at the outset, uphold the rule of law. We're happy to take any questions.
Is this the government getting tough on crime?
I completely reject the terminology of tough on crime and soft on crime. We're focused on what actually works. So I've been on the road with the Commissioner over the last 2 weeks, visiting police stations up and down the country. I think, rhetoric like tough on crime and soft on crime means absolutely nothing. What we want to know is that we're giving the tools to the police to do things that are going to work to disrupt criminal offending, and that's exactly what we've been doing.
You mentioned hitting the gangs where it hurts, right? Since you took office, well, since just before you took office, the numbers show that gang member rates have more than doubled. So why do this now? Why not make this a priority as soon as you got in? The numbers were trending that way.
Oh, look, there's a variety of things that have been at play there in terms of the growth in gang-related activity. The police haven't been doing nothing during that time. I reject the idea that this is something that we're suddenly doing. There's been a whole program of work, and if you look at Operation Tawhero that I just mentioned, 1,800 firearms seized through that operation alone. There has been a lot of activity in that space.
But numbers have still spiralled, haven't they?
Oh, look, the growth in gang membership is complex, and that's not something that we're going to turn around immediately overnight. We've got to actually get underneath that and say, why are people joining gangs in the first place? What's the market that gangs are tapping into? And clearly, there's a drug addiction market there that gangs are making a lot of money off. Those are complex problems, and we will absolutely tackle those as well. But in the meantime, we have to deal with the immediate offending that's in front of us, and that's what we're aiming to do.
We've interviewed people on the streets who, frankly, should be dead. People have driven past their houses, they've got kids in there, they've had gunshots fired into their house, and it's narrowly missed some of these people. What do you say to them?
I say that if you look at the package of measures that we've announced today, it is designed to target exactly that kind of activity. So the new firearms-related offence that we're introducing is discharging a firearm in order to intimidate people. At the moment, there is a loophole in the law that's prevented the police from being able to be tougher on that. They will absolutely be able to take more action in those instances.
Can you guarantee that this suite of measures will curb the rising gang tensions?
Police are working incredibly hard, including Operation Cobalt, which we've just been briefed in more detail on, to really crack down on gang-related activity. But that's a complex piece of work. This set of measures that we're announcing today is not the end of the matter. The government is looking at other issues as well, and we'll continue to work our way through that. I expect there will be further announcements in due course as we identify new practical steps that we can take to really target this illegal activity.
Why haven't you banned gang patches?
Look, ultimately, that's not going to make a huge amount of difference. And the evidence internationally suggests that it tends to displace gang offending and criminal activity, maybe forces it underground, but it doesn't make it go away.
When will we
How
start
long
seeing
will it
these
take?
changes?
We'll be aiming for a relatively speedy legislative process. Obviously, it involves a change to the law, so there's a priority now on getting the law changes drafted. I'll be making sure that happens as quickly as possible, and then we will be working with other parties in Parliament to secure support for the legislation so that it can move its way through the legislative process relatively quickly.
Is as quickly as possible enough comfort for the people that are scared?
Well, the government has to follow the law as well, and so we can't simply announce something and declare that it's the law. It does have to go through a legislative process, but we'll be aiming to make that as efficient as we possibly can.
So will these changes make people feel more comfortable in their own homes?
Well, look, my message to people who are concerned about the escalating level of gang activity across the country is so are we, and we are taking measures that are practical, that are going to make a difference, that the police have advised us will make a difference. We'll continue to look for more things that we can do to disrupt gang offending, and where practical measures come to light that we can take, then we'll work our way through those as well.
And if these changes don't see the improvements that you want to see, will you take responsibility?
Well, like I said, this is not just simply a one-off. This is part of an ongoing program of work. This isn't going to suddenly mean that gang-related activity disappears overnight. We have to actually get underneath some of the causes of that. Gangs have captured a market around illegal drugs, for example, that we can do a lot to disrupt. We are doing a lot to disrupt. And there's been work for many years in that space. So some of the anti-money laundering legislation, for example, is making a difference, but that doesn't happen overnight. So making sure that we're making it as difficult as possible for gangs to operate in that space is important. But I can also tell you, with my other ministerial hats on, that there is a lot more we can do to choke off the supply of new gang recruits as well. If we get young people engaged in constructive activities that doesn't lead them down a path to more serious criminal offending, then we can actually turn some of this around in the medium to longer term as well. And that's what Minister Allan has just outlined. We've got a whole program of work across government in that area.
Yeah, just off the back of Minister Hipkins there, Corrections have a list of over 2,000 young people that are on their known gang associates list. Of those 2,000 gang members, 100% of them had been in contact with police at a younger stage in life. So what Minister Hipkins is saying right here, look, there's not a silver bullet that you can click your fingers and hope that things work right now, but what we can do is take an all-of government approach. We can look at the prevention, the intervention measures, and there are a suite of those going across the board. But just in response to somebody else, that one of the key things, I think we've probably learned this from COVID, is that we are always looking at whether the policy settings that we are making are landing. What we don't want to be is a government of rhetoric. We're a government that's focused on outcomes. So these are the raft of reforms that we're introducing today. As Mr Hipkins said, it's not the end of the line. We'll continue to monitor to see that the policy settings are actually working and working for those that need them most.
I guess there's no silver bullet, but when do you want to see?
Well, right now, arguably, you could say that we're seeing results. Right now, we've just sat with Operation Cobalt and a whole team of people that have been pulled together specifically to target organised gang. They're making interventions, they're making disruptions in activities, whether that's acquiring methamphetamine at earlier stages. So again, it's not this is the start and the end today. The start has been ongoing and there are more and more measures, and this is in addition to the suite of reforms that have already been announced.
When did this loophole become apparent?
Look, I don't know the answer to that, but clearly it's a loophole and it's one that we're moving quickly to close.
So
Marie Drybuck said this morning there is no loophole. Marie Drybuck said this morning that there is no loophole.
Well,
a lot of this can be done within the current settings.
So there are a suite of offences that could be applicable. What we're seeing though is a rise in a particular type of crime. Drive-by shootings aren't something that happened in the 80s and 90s like they are happening right now. So what's going on is that if you have a person who's shooting at a house with the intent to intimidate, yes, you can charge them under a summary offences for intimidation. The maximum penalty, 3 months. I don't think New Zealanders would be satisfied with that as a maximum penalty. Yes, we could also charge them for discharging a firearm. You can charge them under the Firearms Act. Maximum penalty, 6 months. I don't think New Zealanders would be satisfied with that as an outcome. The comparable types of offences that we're looking at, the threat to kill, that carries a maximum of 7 years imprisonment. Threat to kill. Where we've gone here is okay, well there's currently under the Crimes Act, if I am discharging a firearm in a dwelling house, that carries a maximum penalty of 3 years. If I'm doing drive-by shootings, probably in the middle, that would probably be about sufficient and what we think is comparable across the board. So yes, there are offences that can be pulled on, but whether they're sufficient, we don't consider that they are.
On
So-
the 14-day
on the
14-day searches, how do you qualify who comes under?
So we've got, clearly, there's some work in the drafting to make sure that we're defining this appropriately, but it is targeted at gang-related activity. So, patched gang members, clearly yes. In the drafting, we'll be very clear around exactly what the parameters of that are. So there isn't a lot of legislative definition around this area at the moment, so that is one of the things that we'll be doing in the next few weeks as we get this drafted.
So the
Just on that, and one of the key criteria there is making sure that there's a gang conflict in place.
Yeah.
I want to draw on the current experiences that we've just had. You've had police officers that have to wait until an offence has been committed, then they can apply for the warrant, and then they can go about and do their activities.
How do you define a gang conflict?
Well, that's exactly what's right now. I mean, this will be part of our process in terms of the definition that we have to go through as part of a policy process. But where you can see known gangs, so we'll need to have known gangs that are engaged in a type of conflict, as we've seen out here with Killer Bees and others. That process there is going to be critical. It can't be just any other kind of behaviour, but it is tagged to that criminal conflict. There needs to be an escalation, and a judicial officer needs to be satisfied that that's the situation.
What would you like to see? How would you like that defined? Do you guys have a preference? A certain amount of shootings or something like that? Or?
Well, I think that where you can see that there's a real disturbance to public safety. So it hinges, the third part of that offence that we're looking at is that where there is a real threat to public safety and broader public safety. I think that's got to be the threshold here. We've got ordinary New Zealanders who have the right to feel safe in their homes. They don't right now because of this particular type of activity.
So the ultimate protection here is that police will have to convince the person issuing the warrant that there is an escalating tension between gangs that needs to be addressed.
So it needs to be escalating, does it?
Or a heightened degree of tension between gangs. There is gang conflict at play.
What would be insufficient? I can, and we've turned our minds to these types of issues. What would be insufficient is a person that has a patch. That's insufficient. That's not a gang conflict.
Yeah.
What we need to see is that there is absolute conflict between gang A, gang B. That's creating a situation.
But for example, the Killer Bees and the tribesmen have had conflict which has lasted years. Could these searches be used?
Carte blanche?
Yeah,
No.
in a time where there isn't some sort of tit-for-tat shooting going on.
No, so that's the purpose of this warrant, so that you have to be able to convince a judicial officer that there is a current escalation in conflict, that is a threat to the broader public safety, and it meets the threshold that requires these particular types of surveillance powers.
What is the safeguard that James is talking about, sort of bottom of the cliff? What's the safeguard at the top of the cliff? Is this what you're talking about, reducing people going in there in the first place, joining gangs in the first place?
Yeah, look, we've got more work happening in that space, which we're not obviously announcing today.
Yeah.
But the work at the top of the cliff clearly is around drug harm minimisation. It's around making sure that we're reducing the number of young people who are falling into the pathway that's leading them to join gangs in the first place. And a variety of other, some of the community resilience work that we're doing, so that communities are more resilient to gang-related activity. Let's be really clear here. I don't just want to drive the gangs underground and then say that's the problem solved. We want to drive their criminal activity out of the community completely. What we've seen from the National Party, for example, a statement saying that if people can't see gang offending, then it doesn't matter. Actually, it matters, regardless of whether you can see it or not. We want to drive that criminal offending out of the community.
So you've been touring around the police districts, right? Can you name a couple of programs that you've seen that have been making a difference?
Look, I mean,
specifically, let's name a couple here. Specifically,
Operation Torpedo in terms of gangs.
Sorry, not police operations, sort of community-based, whatever you want to call it, initiatives.
If we're talking about preventing young people falling into gangs, for example, There are a whole lot of programs that we funded through COVID-19 through a thing called the Ākonga Fund, which was administered by the Ministry of Youth Development, which was around giving young people positive things to engage in, and it was particularly targeted at those more vulnerable young people in the community. In my own area, the Billy Graham Boxing Academy, for example, had outstanding outcomes where they got young people who were otherwise getting into trouble. They gave them something constructive to engage with. Those kids are more regularly attending school. They're doing better in school. They're not getting into trouble. That's just one example, but there are countless others. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model. Many of these solutions are going to come from within the community. And so our job as government is to say, okay, how can we better support those community initiatives, wherever they're emerging, to make sure that we're giving young people something useful to do that's going to keep them out of trouble.
What is the threshold going to be for the high value items prohibited for cash sale?
We've got to finalise that. We've just been in conversation. We've just had a conversation about that at the moment. So we'll finalise that in the drafting process.
And does the new law about stopping intimidatory gunshots cover raw people firing in the air to ward off rustlers and equipment thieves?
Yeah, so the issue here is where there is that intention to intimidate. So the threshold applies. These aren't these are carte blanche offences. That's what the Bill of Rights requires. So if you are going out with the intent to intimidate any person with a gun and discharging it at them, it'll be at the discretion to the police as to how they'll charge you then.
Why are gangs so emboldened right now? Why are gangs so emboldened right now? Why?
Look, we've seen an escalation in gang-related activity, particularly associated with the importation of a pattern of criminal offending that we haven't seen associated with gangs in New Zealand to the extent that we are seeing now. 501s being deported from Australia is one of the contributing factors. Clearly we've got more work that we need to do in this area, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Different types of recruitment techniques, I think, as well, has been really enticing, and it does come off the back of what Minister Hipkins was just saying there. There's a new way of recruiting young people. I'm thinking about my patch in the East Coast. It used to be quite you think back to once Warriors, and that was the kind of introduction to gang life for many people. It's not quite the same across the board now. It's much more of a enticing lifestyle with bikes and bling and etc. So you'll see that some of these targeted measures that we're introducing are really targeted towards some of the newer measures that are enabling people to enter into those life pathways.
Did the police raise this loophole?
Yes, it was one of the issues that has come out of discussions over the last little while. And like I said, this type of drive-by shooting hasn't been a significant issue for policing in the same way that it has really magnified itself over the last few months. So look, I think our job as lawmakers is always to look to those that are on the front lines. Have you got the adequate tools? They've told us that this would be a useful provision and a useful fix, and we agree it's evidence-based and it will have an impact for them.
When did it come across, either of your desks though?
We've both only been in the job for a couple of weeks now.
Your predecessors. Was this raised with Minister Williams?
Look, I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that. I haven't read every briefing that she ever received as the Minister, but I think Minister Allan has just made the point that we're seeing an escalation in this type of activity that we haven't seen before, and that has clearly brought this loophole to light.
Have you
now we're going to have to get planes shortly, so we'll do a couple more questions here.
Have you canvassed any other parties to see whether they will support these changes, or do you anticipate they will?
Not yet, but I'm very optimistic.
Have you had any?
Actually, I had a discussion with Chris Bishop this morning, and he seemed to be quite persuaded by some of the pragmatism associated with the, particularly the, what provision was it? Oh, the intent to intimidate for discharging a firearm.
There was an amendment in 2021 to the Arms Act legislation. We are still seeing a rise in shooting. Is the legislation even working?
Oh, I think let's be clear about the firearms-related legislation that we passed over the last 4 years. This is not going to be an overnight process, so we've got a lot of guns off the street. That doesn't mean that we're there yet. Some of that legislation hasn't even been implemented yet. The firearms register, for example, is going to play a really critical role in getting firearms out of the hands of gang members. Last data that I saw suggests that there is only one member on the gang register who has a firearms licence. So they are getting their firearms elsewhere. they're either stealing them or they're getting them from licensed firearm owners who are buying them and then selling them to the gang members. The register will put a stop to that. It will mean that we will be able to track and trace the firearms. That's going to make a difference. That hasn't been fully implemented yet. So, this is a really big program of work that's really sort of hitting its stride now.
How politically damaging are gangs, and how important is it that the public stop talking about them?
Oh, look, I'm not interested in the politics, frankly. I'm not interested in the solution. Gang-related activity is a problem for our community. And as I've said before, I don't just want people to stop talking about it, or I don't want to force it underground. I want to deal with the problem. We want to make sure that we're driving the criminal offending that's being done by gangs out of our communities altogether.
So what's the measure of success? Is it gang numbers?
It's the offending. We're going after the offending, but it's a complex problem. We've also got to look at the drugs as well, because gang members selling drugs to people is causing enormous harm in our community. So we have to go after that as well.
Why did the government let it get so bad before making these changes?
Look, I disagree with that, with the sort of overall premise of that assertion. The police have been working alongside the government, alongside other agencies, to tackle gang-related activity over the last 5 years that we have been in government. And we haven't done nothing during that time. We've done a lot of things during that time. There's always going to be more work to do.
You mentioned that drugs is a big issue. And at the start you said that Tofedo had seized 10 kilos worth of meth. I've got new data that says that the price of meth has actually decreased over the past 6 months, suggesting that supply has gone up. Do you think police, or these kind of more search warrants, are really the solve to finding more drugs and getting meth off the streets?
Look, there's a lot that we can do in the drug space, and that we will be doing in the drug space. I'm sure that we'll be coming back in due course with more initiatives that we can do there. In terms of the market price for drugs, one of the things that I have discovered on my travels, there is a different price in different parts of the country. New Zealand's prices for illegal drugs are relatively high compared to international standards. But again, let's target the problem here. I don't just want to make the price go up or down. We actually want to get these drugs out of the community.
Have you had any conversations, final question, any conversations with gang members or with their leaders, just about having that open conversation with them and actually understanding what's going on in their side?
Look, not in the last few weeks. It'd be fair to say I've had plenty of conversations with gang members in my own electorate and my own community over the time that I have been a Member of Parliament. And also have had conversations with people who are working with the gangs to actually target some of the gang activity to provide a pathway out of criminal offending for gang members and gang prospects. And so, I've been able to draw on that experience, but I know Minister Allan has had more conversations in recent weeks.
Yeah, look, I certainly have engaged with people who have expertise in these fields. Like I said, the last thing we want to do is do what they did in the 90s, do what they did in the 2000s, introduce a range of policy reforms that actually didn't tackle the issue. We wanted these to be evidence-based solutions that would actually work. So yes, have worked alongside those that are experts in these fields that have strong working relationships across the board with police, with others, to make sure that these targeted sweeps would actually have the impact that we desire.
Great.
Okay,
We better go. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.